It is a little after sunset on a Thursday, in the spring of a year somewhere around 30 AD. A man walks out of the city of Jerusalem, down across a narrow valley and up into a grove of old olive trees. He has just finished a meal with his closest friends. He has fewer than 24 hours left to live. And this is the strange part. He already knows it. We tend to remember this story in pieces. A garden, a trial, a hill, a cross. But it did not happen in pieces. It happened as one unbroken stretch of time, hour after hour, room after room, the decision after decision. And almost nothing about it is where most of us picture it. Start with where he's walking. The grove has a name. In the language he spoke, it's Gethsemane. And it does not mean garden of peace. It means the oil press, the place where olives are piled under a great stone and crushed until they have nothing left to give but oil. Hold on to that image, because by the end of this, it's going to matter more than you'd think. In fact, 3 ancient words are going to quietly reshape this whole day. One of them is the name of that garden. One is a word a doctor chose to describe what happened to his body. And the last one, the most important one, is a single word he speaks at 3 o'clock the next afternoon. A word that Roman merchants used to stamp across the bottom of a paid receipt. So let's not skip ahead. Let's walk these 24 hours the way they actually unfolded. Not as a sermon, but as an investigation. Start the clock. Before the garden, there was a meal, and it's worth slowing down on it because the setting carries half the meaning. It's Passover week, and first century Jerusalem during Passover is not the quiet little town of a children's storybook. It's a city bursting at the seams, pilgrims pouring in by the tens of thousands, the population swelling several times over. Roman soldiers posted on the rooftops because crowds plus a festival about freedom from slavery is exactly the kind of thing an occupying empire watches nervously. Into all of that, 13 men crowd into a borrowed upper room to share the Passover meal, a meal that, by its very design, is about remembering a rescue, bread eaten in a hurry, a cup, a lamb. The retelling of a night centuries earlier when death passed over and a people walked out of bondage. And the host does 2 things at this meal that his friends will spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. First, he kneels and washes their feet. This was slaves' work. A teacher washing the feet of his students turned the whole social order upside down, and you can feel the discomfort in the room. There's something else he does with the meal itself. He takes the unleavened bread, the bread of the rescue story, breaks it, and tells them it is his body given for them. He takes the cup and tells them it is a new covenant in his blood. To the men in that room, steeped in the language of Passover, this would have landed like a thunderclap. The host is quietly placing himself in the role of the Passover lamb, the one whose death lets the rest go free. They almost certainly do not understand it yet. By tomorrow afternoon, they will. Then, in the middle of the meal, he says something that stops everything cold. The World English Bible puts it plainly. One of you will betray me. Now watch what he does not do. He doesn't name the man out loud and have him dragged from the room. He hands him a piece of bread, a gesture of friendship, and lets him go. And Judas slips out into the dark. John records the moment with 4 words that filmmakers love and sermons usually rush past. And it was night. It isn't just a detail of lighting. It's a timestamp. The clock has started, and it is the last ordinary evening of his life. Back to the oil press. Picture how one actually worked. you'd harvest the olives, pile them beneath an enormous circular stone, and then you'd add weight and more weight, turning the stone until the fruit had no choice but to surrender everything inside it. The very first pressing gave the finest oil, but there was no oil without the crushing. That is the ground he kneels on now, in a garden whose name means the press. And here Luke, who tradition remembers as a physician, reaches for a very precise Greek word. Most English Bibles say he was in agony, but the Greek word underneath is agōnia, and in the first century, that word did not mainly mean fear. It was an athlete's word. It described the coiled tension in a wrestler's body in the seconds before the contest begins. Every muscle loaded, the whole self braced for a fight. This is not the picture of a man falling apart. It's the picture of a man bracing for the hardest contest of his life. He prays the same thing 3 times. He asks, in effect, whether there is any other way, whether this cup might pass. That image of the cup matters. In the Hebrew scriptures, the cup is often the cup of suffering, the thing you are handed and have to drink to the bottom. He's not asking to skip a bad afternoon. He's staring into the hole of what's coming and asking if it can be taken away. And 3 times he lands in the same place. Not my will, but yours. Just yards away, his closest friends, the men he asked to stay awake with him, keep falling asleep. He goes through the worst hour of his life essentially alone. Luke adds that an angel appears to strengthen him. And then comes the line no other gospel records. He writes that the sweat became like great drops of blood, and the word he chooses for drops, thromboi, literally means clots. Now here we have to be careful and honest. The way this channel always tries to be. Some modern physicians point to a rare condition called hematidrosis. Under extreme sustained stress, the tiny blood vessels around the sweat glands can rupture, and a person can, in fact, sweat blood. Is that exactly what Luke is describing? We can't prove it. Luke says the sweat was like drops of blood. It may be a vivid comparison rather than a clinical diagnosis. But notice that whichever reading you take, the picture matches the place perfectly. A human being under a pressure so total that the body itself begins to give way. The olive in the press. And then, between the trees, torches, Judas comes back and he brings an armed crowd with him. And the signal he uses to identify his teacher in the dark is a kiss. The arrest is fast. The friends scatter. And here is where almost every retelling flattens the timeline completely. We say, the trial, singular, as if there were one courtroom and one verdict. There wasn't. Over the next several hours, this one man is marched through 6 separate hearings. 3 before Jewish authorities, 3 before Roman ones. First, he's taken to Annas, a former high priest, the real power behind the scenes. Then to Caiaphas, the sitting high priest, where members of the ruling council have gathered in the middle of the night. Witnesses are produced. The Gospels say their stories don't even agree. Finally, he's asked directly whether he is the Messiah, and his answer is what they decide to act on. So, was any of this legal? Here, I want to give you the strongest version of the objection. Not a straw man. Jewish legal tradition, written down generations later in a collection called the Mishnah, lays out rules for capital cases. Trials like this shouldn't happen at night. A guilty verdict shouldn't be reached the same day it's heard. And you certainly shouldn't be doing any of this on the eve of a major festival. By those standards, what happens here looks deeply irregular. But And this is the honest complication. Those written rules come from a later period, and scholars genuinely disagree about how strictly or even whether they applied in this exact decade. Some historians read this as a railroaded trial that broke the rules. Others argue it wasn't a formal trial at all, but an emergency, late-night effort to assemble a charge that Rome would be willing to act on. Either way, the scene we're left with is not a calm courtroom. It's a rush in the dark, against the clock, and out in the courtyard. The whole story suddenly narrows down to one man warming his hands at a fire. 3 times, someone looks at Peter and says, "You were with him." 3 times Peter says, "I don't know the man." Then a rooster crows, and Luke records the detail that has broken readers' hearts for 2,000 years. At that moment, the prisoner being led across the courtyard turns and looks directly at him. There's a second man to follow here too. Judas, the Gospels tell us, is overcome with remorse, tries to return the money he was paid, and takes his own life before the day is over. 2 friends, 2 failures. One ends in tears and is restored. The other ends in despair. The Gospel writers leave that contrast sitting there on purpose. By now, the sky is going gray, and the council has a problem. Under Roman occupation, they cannot carry out an execution themselves. For that, they need the governor. Enter Pontius Pilate. And here's something worth knowing. We don't only meet Pilate in the Gospels. He also appears in the writings of the Jewish historians Josephus and Philo. And the man they describe is not a soft, hand-wringing bureaucrat. He's a governor who could be stubborn, harsh, and openly contemptuous of the people he ruled. A man who had already provoked the city more than once. That portrait is worth holding next to the gospel scenes where Pilate comes across as reluctant, almost trapped. Historians have argued about that tension for a very long time. And rather than tie it up in a neat bow, I'll just let you sit with it. What's clear in every account is the maneuvering. Pilate would rather not own this. He learns the prisoner is Galilean and seizes on a loophole. Galilee is Herod Antipas's jurisdiction, and Herod happens to be in the city for the festival. So Pilate ships the problem across town. Herod, the Gospels say, is mostly curious, hoping to see a miracle. When none comes, he mocks the prisoner and sends him back. So Pilate is stuck with him again, and he reaches for one more escape hatch, a Passover custom of releasing a single prisoner to the crowd. He offers them a choice. This teacher, or a man named Barabbas, held for insurrection and murder. There's a quiet irony the original audience would have caught. The name Barabbas means, roughly, son of the Father. The crowd is offered 2 sons of the Father, and they choose the violent one. Pilate's wife sends him a warning about a dream. Pilate asks the prisoner a question that has echoed for centuries. What is truth? And doesn't wait for an answer. And finally, John gives us the exact spot where Pilate sits to render judgment. He names it Golgotha. In Greek, lithostrotos, the stone pavement, a real, locatable place, paved in stone, where an ordinary morning hardened into a death sentence. And that sentence begins with a word that sounds almost mild in English. He had him scourged. Roman scourging was not a slap on the wrist. The instrument was a flagellum, leather thongs, often weighted with fragments of bone or metal built to tear. I'm not going to dwell on the physical detail, because the point here isn't shock. The point is that by the time it was over, a strong, healthy man would already be in physical shock, losing blood, his body in crisis, before the execution had even begun. Then the soldiers add cruelty for its own sake. They want to mock a so-called king, so they braid together a crown, not of soft greenery, but of long, hard thorns, and force it onto his head. A crown turned into an instrument of pain. They throw a robe on him, bow in fake homage, and laugh. And now, the walk. Here is one of the most common things we picture wrong. We imagine him carrying the entire cross, the long, upright beam and all, down the street. He almost certainly didn't. In standard Roman practice, the vertical stake often stayed fixed in the ground at the execution site. What the condemned man carried was the patibulum, the crossbeam alone, still brutally heavy. Heavy enough that, the Gospels tell us, the soldiers pull a man out of the crowd. Simon, from Cyrene in North Africa, just passing through, and force him to carry it the rest of the way. And here's a small detail that historians love. Mark names Simon's two sons, Alexander and Rufus, as if his readers would recognize them, which suggests this random bystander, dragged into the worst moment of someone else's day, became known in the early community, a man who walked into the city for a festival and walked out carrying a cross. Along the road, the Gospels mention women weeping. Above his head, they fix a placard, a titulus, naming his supposed crime, written, John says, in 3 languages so every passerby could read it. The King of the Jews. Half a joke, half a warning. The destination is a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, public, right beside a road. Chosen on purpose because the entire point of crucifixion was to be seen. It was Rome's billboard. This is what happens to those who defy us. As for the crucifixion itself, historically and medically, death usually came not from the wounds alone, but from the position of the body. Suspended from outstretched arms, a person slowly loses the ability to breathe out. To take each breath, the body has to push upward against the nails. Over hours, exhaustion wins, and breathing finally fails. It was engineered to be slow. That was the point. Mark tells us he was nailed up around the 3rd hour, about 9 in the morning, and then, at noon, in the middle of the day, the sky goes dark. For 3 hours, darkness. The Gospels don't over-explain it. They just mark it like a held breath across the whole land. In those final hours, the Gospels record several short sayings from the cross, and each one points outward, away from himself. He asks forgiveness for the very men driving the nails. They don't know what they're doing. He turns to a condemned criminal hanging beside him, a man with nothing left to offer, and promises him a place in paradise that same day. He looks down at his mother, watching her son die, and makes sure, with almost domestic tenderness, that someone will take her into their home and care for her. Even here, even now, the attention keeps moving toward other people. And then, out of the darkness, comes a cry that has unsettled readers for 2,000 years. In Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It sounds like the sound of pure abandonment. But here's what a 1st century listener would have recognized instantly, and what we almost always miss. Those are not random words of despair. They are the opening line of Psalm 22, a song every devout Jew knew by heart. A psalm that begins in anguish and describes, with eerie precision, a sufferer with pierced hands and feet, mocked by onlookers casting lots for his clothing, and then turns, before it ends, toward rescue and vindication and a coming kingdom. In that world, to quote a psalm's first line was to invoke the whole thing, So whether you hear a man at the edge of despair or a man using his last breath to point at a song that bends toward triumph, the gospel writers clearly want you to catch the echo. And then, near the very end, John records one final word. In English, we translate it as 3 or 4 words. It is finished. But in Greek, it is a single word, tetelestai, tetelestai. And here is the loop finally closing. Archaeologists have found this exact word on ancient business documents, on receipts, on records of debt. Stamped across the bottom of a bill, tetelestai meant one specific thing: paid in full. The debt is discharged, complete. So sit for a second with the 3 words this single day has quietly been built around. It begins in Gethsemane, the press, where he is crushed like an olive until everything is given up. It moves through agōnia, the contest, a fighter braced for the hardest match there is. And it ends not with the word defeated, not destroyed, but tetelestai, finished, paid, done. Whatever you personally believe it means, and people believe very different things about that, you cannot honestly call this the vocabulary of an accident or of a man simply overtaken by events. From the name of the garden to the final word, it reads like the language of something completed on purpose. At the moment he dies, 2 more things happen that the Gospels insist on. The heavy curtain in the temple, the one that walled off the holiest space, the place ordinary people could never enter. Tears in 2, from top to bottom. The direction matters in the telling. Torn from the top down, as if from above, not from below. Whatever you make of it, the writers are making a claim with that image, that the barrier between people and the holy has just been removed, not by a worshiper reaching up, but by something coming down, and a Roman officer of all people, the man in charge of the execution, who had surely watched dozens of men die on these crosses, looks at how this one died and says, in effect, this man really was the Son of God. The first confession in the whole scene comes not from a friend or a follower, but from the enemy still holding the spear. It's about 3 in the afternoon. Roughly 24 hours since a man walked into a grove named after crushing. In a single day, he moved from a borrowed dinner table to a press in the dark, through 6 trials, down a road lined with onlookers, to a hill beside a public highway. And through every hour of it, the words keep insisting that this was not a man swept along by forces bigger than him, but a man walking on purpose towards something he could finally call finished. You don't have to share his faith to feel the weight of that. Most of us spend our whole lives quietly afraid of the things we'll leave undone, the unfinished, the unpaid, the unresolved. And here is a story built from its very first place name to its very last word around the opposite idea: completion, paid in full, done. But these 24 hours don't actually end the story. The friends who scattered into the dark that night, every one of them went on to lives and deaths in places you would never expect. I traced what really happened to all 12, and that video is right here. I'll meet you there.